Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Robin Dand, and I am the Secretary General to the Federation of Cocoa Commerce, otherwise known as the FCC, and I am your host for today. I am addressing you from the heart of the City of London and welcome you all to this, the first FCC webinar, which is entitled Price and Climate, Drivers of Cocoa Production. I can legitimately say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, as we have registrations from all continents except Antarctica. And so one of these greetings will indeed apply to you. Thank you for your attendance. For those who are unaware, the FCC primarily exists to publish sale contract terms for the international trade of cocoa beans and cocoa products, and to provide contracting parties an arbitration service in the event of a dispute. However, we are also involved in education through cocoa courses, online modules, and now, of course, webinars. I'm delighted to inform you that the format today is that we shall have two presentations, each of around 20 minutes, to be followed by a panel discussion that will be moderated by the Vice Chairman of the FCC, Keith Heffernan, who is Strategic Sourcing Director for Cocoa Butter of Mars Wrigley. We shall finish at 13:30 London time. Before I introduce our two presenters, I would like to make it clear to you all that this webinar and others hosted by the FCC are done so under the Chatham House rule. For those that need reminding, the rule states, when a meeting or part thereof is held under the Chatham House rule, participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers, nor that of any other participant may be revealed. Now, for the purpose of this rule is to help promote discussion, not to stop it. So you are free to use the information gained, but if you wish to attribute it to a person in any onward public communication, then please ensure that you have the permission of the person who said it. So now I shall introduce our two presenters. The first of whom is an old friend. He is Steve Wateridge, Head Researcher of Tropical Research Services. Steve is a very able and valued contributor to our educational courses, and I'm pleased that he has agreed to help us understand better the long-term relationship between price and cocoa production. His presentation will be followed by that of Dr. Alina Ganusa-Bogdan, Head Climatologist of Climate 42, who I am also very happy has agreed to be with us today. Alina joins us from Bordeaux in France, where she leads a team that is very active on cocoa research in West Africa and will be taking us through how weather and climate affects cocoa production. Following her presentation, Keith will introduce the panel to you, which includes two presenters, and Richard Puddifoot of Ecom Agritrade Limited and Frederick Wenger of Olam International Limited, both of whom are very experienced in this field of interest, and naturally I am also grateful for their contribution. So now, without further ado, I shall entrust you all to the very capable hands of Steve Wateridge. Steve, are you there?
I am indeed. Hello, everybody. And as Robin said, I will be running through the impact of price on cocoa production for about the next 20 minutes. we'll just get the usual disclaimers out of the way. Uh, Anyone who follows the cocoa market will be used to seeing some fairly lurid headlines about the prospects for supply and its impact on price. One minute we seem to be running out of cocoa, the next there's too much of the stuff. I think what most of these articles miss out on is the impact that prices have in regulating production. And to illustrate this, I thought it would be useful to run through price trends over the last 50 years to take a long-term view of how price and other factors influence supply and demand. If we start off in 1972, 50 years ago, prices were at very low levels. We'd come out of a period of large surpluses in the 1960s, a period of overproduction, and the way the market regulates periods of overproduction is to push prices down below cost of production to disincentivize production in the least efficient farmers, and also to stimulate consumption. Throughout the 1970s, this mechanism had the desired effect. We also had some weather events in the mid-1970s that led to an absolute boom in cocoa prices. In fact, in 1977, the New York market hit an all-time record high of $5,000 per ton. If you apply any sort of deflator and try and adjust that into current prices, it's somewhere in the region of $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 a ton. I think one of the reasons that prices exploded to that extent was because of the lack of speculative involvement. This is something I'll come back to a little bit later on, but the market, the only signal it was able to give that there was a severe shortage was basically that we ran out of cocoa. I used to sit next to a chap who was buying cocoa for Rowntree's in the 1970s, and he said they effectively had to shut the factory because they could not get any cocoa. To all intents and purposes, the world had run out. And that meant prices rose to a level where demand was destroyed. That was the only way. If you can't increase supply, you have to destroy demand. The high prices clearly gave a huge incentive for farmers to produce more cocoa. And the unfortunate thing with a tree crop like cocoa is it takes several years for those price signals to translate into higher production. If you look at row crops, wheat, barley, corn, soya, if there's a price explosion in year one, in year two, you can switch from one to the other and produce more of the commodity in short supply. In cocoa, it takes much longer for that price signal to work its way through. So the focus has to be on destroying demand. And that meant throughout the rest of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, we had a situation where production came on stream, demand was very weak because of the high prices, and we moved into a period of massive oversupply. It was at this point in 1981 that the governments of the International Cocoa Organization, both consumers and producing countries, put their heads together and decided that we needed to regulate the market by government intervention, by buying up cheap cocoa and supporting prices above the market price, because in their view, the market just wasn't working. As it happened, this intervention coincided with 2 years of very severe El Nino conditions that devastated the West African crops and led to lower supply and higher prices because of the weather impact. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that the dollar was very strong at this time, prices in dollar terms would have gone much higher. during this period, 1984, 1985, sterling and the dollar traded almost at parity. So farmers who were being paid in CFA or CDs were receiving a much better price than these dollar denominated prices indicate. And for the next 5 years, the ICCO was successful in keeping prices above fair value. The only problem with that policy was that, first of all, it encouraged massive expansion of production in low-cost producing countries like the Ivory Coast. Secondly, it encouraged a huge expansion in production in high-cost producers like Malaysia in particular. And ultimately, like most of these price support mechanisms, it proved unsustainable. The ICCO ran out of the money that was needed to buy up ever growing surpluses. Ultimately, this led to the liquidation of the buffer stock. Oversupply continued to come onto the market for a number of years because of the long-term nature of the cocoa production cycle. And effectively, that resulted in a dozen years of structural surplus weighing down prices below what we would consider to have been fair value. It's a classic case of the law of unintended consequences. The measures to support prices actually led to a long period of low prices. Ultimately, these low prices stimulated demand and adversely affected production, particularly in the high-cost producing areas. The market moved back into something resembling balance. And since then, we've had a situation where when demand has been strong or when supply has been affected by the weather or long-term trends, we've seen prices rally quite strongly. But alternatively, when the reverse is true and we've had bumper crops and weak consumption growth, we've seen prices fall quite sharply. That said, what's noticeable about the last 20 years is that prices have traded within a much narrower range. And I would argue that the main reason for this is that over the last 20 years, we've had significant speculative involvement that's been studying cocoa along with other agricultural commodities and has latched onto, at a very early stage, a situation which is unsustainable in the medium term. So the reason we've never run out of cocoa is because 2 or 3 years in advance, it's been quite clear that prices are too low, that consumption's too strong, that future production is being adversely affected by low prices. Speculators have come in and actually bid up the price of cocoa quite significantly to levels that give an early price signal to farmers that allow them to react to the future shortage. Similarly, when we've had a situation where farmers have overreacted and we've had too much supply coming on stream and demand hasn't been strong enough in a higher price environment, then speculators have looked at that circumstance and shorted the market in order to move prices down and give an early signal before we actually generate overwhelming surpluses or run out of cocoa. It's a classic example of how prices regulate the market. And as I say, this is, in my view, is the main reason why we haven't had a situation like the 1970s where we actually ran out of cocoa. Very recently, we've had a situation which I would argue has generated structural surpluses, but this year, weather's had an adverse effect on production, particularly in Ghana. I'm sure it's something that we will discuss in depth a little bit later on. But again, all that this has done is prevent prices moving lower in the short term. When the weather improves, we've still got enormous production capacity there, which will eventually weigh on prices. And I think this is one of the problems with price support schemes. If your idea of the support price is lower than the free market price, then it's irrelevant because prices will rise above the support price, and uh, it, it, farmers will be paid more than that. So, as I say, it's pretty much irrelevant. The problem occurs when intervention is aimed at supporting prices above the free market price, because that inevitably will generate surpluses. You're encouraging extra production, you're discouraging demand. And as I say, there is an inevitability that this will create surpluses. So any support mechanism that tries to give farmers a higher price has to deal with this challenge: what to do with the surplus production that they will inevitably create. You may get lucky. It may be that the weather intervenes, as it has done, as I say, this year, and then the supply curve moves to the left, and you can justify the higher prices in the short term. But even if you can persuade every single consumer to pay a higher price so that the demand curve is inelastic, you still create a surplus, because all you're doing is encouraging efficient producers to produce more, inefficient producers to enter the market. You're encouraging production to be expanded through bringing more area under production and a significant improvement in yields. And unless you can deal with that surplus, then ultimately price support measures are doomed to failure. To put this into context, I think if you look at the long-term production trends and the share of production, it's quite clear that Africa has a competitive advantage. I think peasant agriculture in Africa is much more cost effective than commercial farms in places like Asia and South America. The one time we stimulated enormous production in Asia was basically when the ICCO introduced its high support price, which suddenly made Malaysia economic. So during the early 1980s, there was a huge expansion in production in Malaysia. Even when prices collapsed towards the end of the decade and into the early 1990s, there was an effort on the part of the Malaysians to cling on, hoping that someone else would suffer and exit the market before they did. Eventually, they gave up and converted to more remunerative crops like rubber, palm oil, and cocoa production collapsed. But that's a classic example, as I say, of the law of unintended consequences of encouraging inefficient production to come on stream through high support prices. And the area we have to be careful of over stimulating production at the moment, I think, is South America. Ecuador has seen a huge expansion in cocoa production, but there's a lot more land available and a lot more ability to increase yields if prices are supported at too high a level. So again, it's not just a question of stimulating more production in West Africa, where the farmers are more efficient. You've got to be very careful not to bring on inefficient production in other areas around the world. So that's my the crux of my presentation. I know we have a question and answer session at the end, and hopefully most of the questions that come up will be answered. But if anyone doesn't have their question answered or wants to reach out directly, make a note of my email address, and I'd be more than happy to engage in conversation with you. And at that point, I will hand over to Alina, and she can talk you through the impact of climate on cocoa production. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was a very good talk. I will try to follow it up. Let me just first share my screen real quickly. So here we go. All right. So you have seen how economic incentives drive overall cocoa production in the long run. But what are the mechanics that lead from higher or lower prices to more or less cocoa beans being produced in a given region? So we talk, of course, of farm and land management. They will have a direct impact on production. For example, planting new trees or replacing old trees so that land is optimized for production, applying fertilizers, fungicides, and insecticides to lower the risk of disease and improve yields, artificial pollination to optimize setting, pruning and husbandry to reduce a tree's wasted resources and optimize yield, as yet again. All of these measures affect how much a region produces. However, the effects of each of these measures take very different time. Some actions can have relatively fast consequences. So for example, manual pollination can take as little as 6 months to see a change in that region's production, the typical time needed to get from a pollinated flower to beans reaching the ports. But this depends on what time of the year the decision is made. So if the market signal to increase production happens, let's say in December, then if you're in West Africa, no action on manual pollination can be taken until good climate conditions line up all the way in April, which will delay the resulting production. At the other end of the spectrum, for example, if we want to increase production with new trees, it will take much longer. It requires a minimum of 4 to 6 months for the seedlings themselves to develop, variable time lags for them to be delivered and planted in the farms, and then we still have to wait a minimum of 2 to 3 years until the new trees start being able to produce cocoa. So all in all, it will be a few years between the decision that was based on the signals from the market and the resulting increase in production. All of this is to show that at shorter timescales, the relationship between the market and the actual production is not straightforward. And then, of course, there is another external factor that can significantly affect this relationship: the climate. Differences in climate can lead to significant variations around the long-term trend in cocoa production and can affect both the quality and quantity of cocoa being produced. And this is what we will be focusing on for the rest of this webinar. Different climatic conditions can have a big impact on how the trees manage cocoa production, at timescales of a few months to over a year. In the following, we will be mainly focusing on the different climate impacts on trees in the world's main production region, in West Africa, but most of these effects apply to cocoa trees no matter where they grow. So let's start with the most obvious. Let's start with water. Cocoa trees in West Africa are very dependent on rainfall. Cocoa plant originated in the Amazon basin, where it always had constant access to water. So cocoa trees developed very shallow roots, which means they rely on water near the surface and cannot take advantage of the deep soil water reserves that provide a more stable supply. Cocoa trees need on average between 16 and 2400 millimeters of rain per year for optimal production. But West African cocoa regions typically receive between 12 and 1500 millimeters of rain, close to the bare minimum that a tree needs for survival. The result of this is that year-to-year variations can make huge differences to a tree's production. Why? Well, water availability is essential for a plant to produce its energy. If a plant can easily access water, then it will be free to transpire as much as it wants. And transpiration is key for photosynthesis to take place, which in turn is the source of the plant's energy and the core of the production process. If, however, the plant does not have easy access to water, then it will need to limit its transpiration because it must not use up its water reserves. Low transpiration rates mean low photosynthesis, which means the plant will not create the additional energy needed for production. But then there are other ways in which rain impacts the trees. So for example, when a cocoa tree passes from dry to wet conditions, this triggers a wave of leaf flushing and flowering. So leaf flushing happens as soon as a tree sees an increase in soil moisture after a dry period. This leaf flushing will replenish a weakened canopy, and then a healthier, stronger canopy will help boost the tree's rates of photosynthesis and build up energy to produce more flowers, more setting, and more pods. Flowering is then triggered, but only after the canopy has been sufficiently replenished. Next, the clouds themselves help trees by reducing direct radiation from the sun. So cocoa evolved as an understory tree in the moist Amazon basin. This means that it grew among taller tree species, which shaded it from direct sunlight. So cocoa trees developed in medium to low levels of sun, and they still prefer light that has been scattered by clouds or shade trees instead of direct sunlight. Now, rains also affect the activity of pollinators. Cocoa relies a lot on midges to carry out the delicate work of pollination. When it rains, these midges cannot fly, so they can easily miss the narrow window of time when a flower is open to pollen transfer. It is just a matter of hours, and the flower needs to be visited by several insects in order to be properly pollinated. And finally, rains are a key actor in the spread of fungal diseases, which can lead to significant losses to the crop. So when the soil is continuously wet, this increases the amount of black pod spores, which are spread from the soil to the pods via droplet splashing. At the same time, the wet surface of the pods creates an ideal home for the spores to thrive, infect the pod, and then further spread the disease, resulting in hard to predict, but often large losses to the crop. Now, typically, when we think of rain-related issues, we think of water shortage. Not enough water will create hydric stress in the plants, which will cause them to shift their resources and energy towards developing more roots to search for more water. So at this point, the plant's main focus becomes survival rather than pod production. As part of this survival, plants will also shed old leaves, which are not very productive. This reduces the canopy, which will put a further big limitation on production. Furthermore, as soon as water becomes available again, one of the tree's first priorities will be to replenish their canopies. And this is time-consuming, but it is essential before the trees can return their focus to pod and bean production. And both of these effects typically lead to Cherelle wilt and small bean sizes, the most well-known effects of drought on the cocoa tree. But as it turns out, you can definitely also have too much rain. So for example, waterlogging can cause severe damage to the roots and even lead to the plant's death if it lasts too long. Even just a few days of waterlogging can have dire consequences on the tree's production, as the tree will be prone to abort cherelles and even pods. Just to give an idea, the number of sacrificed fruits grows exponentially with the number of days of waterlogging. Excessive rainfall also affects pollination. So not only, as we have just seen, does it impede midges from flying, but heavy rains can also damage the fragile flowers, as well as reduce the mobility of the pollen and thus making it less likely to spread. So too much water increases nutrient leaching from the soil as well. Rains can transport nutrients out of the range of the tree's roots, making them unavailable to the plants that need them. And finally, too much rain will affect other activities such as bean drying and storage. And in this case, dampness can lead to the development and spread of molds and to major crop losses. As you can see, there is much more to the role of precipitations on cocoa than rain is good. By understanding the different effects of precipitation amounts, distribution, and timing on the cocoa tree, we can have a better grasp of the overall effect it will have on cocoa production. But precipitation is not the only way climate can affect cocoa. While often disregarded, temperatures also affect the cocoa tree and its bean production in numerous ways. So let us start by first looking at the typical temperature conditions over West Africa. Now, temperatures vary throughout the year in a very similar way across the entire African cocoa belt, ranging from average daily temperatures of 23-26 degrees Celsius in July, August, to 28-30 degrees at their peak in February, March. And it is also during this time of the year when cocoa regions can experience their hottest days and their coldest nights, with temperatures that can range from 15 all the way up to 38 degrees Celsius, a wide range which has implications on how the tree manages its production. Meanwhile, cocoa's optimum growth temperature is 24 degrees at night and 30 degrees during the day. So when we experience large variations away from this, the trees are going to react. We will, for example, see large effects on photosynthesis. This process relies on a chain of enzymes, which are at their most efficient between 31 and 33 degrees Celsius. Above or below this range, the efficiency of photosynthesis is reduced. And decreased rates of photosynthesis affect the growth of roots and leaves, as well as the rates and quality of pod production. Temperatures also affect the plant's respiration. Now, in general, higher temperatures lead to higher respiration rates, which then has different consequences on the tree depending on water availability. So if there is enough water, then all of the plant's processes will simply accelerate, including pod filling and ripening, meaning that crops will come to term faster. If, however, the plant does not have enough access to water, then it will attempt to safeguard its resources by aborting shirelles, increasing the rate of shirelle wilt, of course. In addition, pod ripening will accelerate, but pod filling and bean growth inside the pods will not be able to follow this faster pace in the absence of enough water. And this results in smaller beans and, in the most extreme cases, in premature ripening and the complete loss of those pods' production. And finally, temperatures also affect bean quality, as they have different effects on cocoa bean fat content and butter hardness, but we will not have enough time to go into it here. So far, we have seen how the two most thought of climate variables, precipitation and temperature, have multiple effects on cocoa trees. But in West Africa, there is also another very important climate phenomenon that can have a big impact on cocoa production, the harmattan. The harmattan is a dry desert wind blowing over the Sahara Desert that flows from the northeast down to the southwest. Its intensity varies each year. So some years it will reach the cocoa regions, others not so much. So what exactly happens when the harmattan does hit the cocoa regions? Well, several important changes in the environment take place. First, the harmattan creates a thick and dry air column. This acts as a blockade and makes it impossible for rain to form while the harmattan is present. Next, the air humidity, that is normally constant at around 90% throughout the year, can quickly drop to below 40% under harmattan conditions, which is a huge shock to the plant system that is not used to this level of dryness. On top of this, both the dry air and the wind of the harmattan also make for faster drying of the leaves and soil. And this is especially stressful for the plants because the harmattan takes place during the main dry season, when access to water is already extremely limited. And finally, the harmattan also brings large swings between day and night temperatures. This temperature shock reduces the plant's efficiency, making it less willing to invest in pod production and development, which affects the number, size, and quality of the pods. So now you might be wondering, okay, but why is cocoa so particularly sensitive to the harmattan? As we mentioned earlier, cocoa plants originated in the Amazon rainforest, where they never needed to deal with water limitations. As such, the plant structure developed without taking into account possible water shortage or a dry atmosphere. So for example, they have large, broad leaves with very little waxing, which makes it very difficult for the leaf to keep water in. At the same time, their root system is shallow, so they cannot access the deep soil water. And as a result, the plants have to rely on getting water from the soil that is closest to the surface, which is also the layer that dries out first when rainfall is stopped by the harmattan and when its winds dry the soil surface. Okay, so now that we know that cocoa plants are very sensitive to the harmattan, is there a way to track it? The answer is yes, and for this we need to take a step back and have a look at all of West Africa. This region is dominated by two major air masses, the Saharan air mass to the north and the monsoon air mass to the south. And where these two air masses meet is called the Intertropical Front, or the ITF. And we monitor the ITF's movement as a proxy for the southernmost reach of the harmattan. Now, generally speaking, the harmattan's seasonal move southwards ends just above the northern border of the cocoa regions. And this is good news for the cocoa crops, because for the most part, the plants should not be too exposed to the negative impacts we talked about earlier. But there are small variations in this southward reach of the ITF from one year to the next. And these small differences can make all the difference between the harmattan heavily hitting the cocoa regions or being a non-event. This is why the harmattan is such a wild card when it comes to predicting the African cocoa crops, and why we monitor it consistently, and in the last years have also started acquiring skill in predicting it. Now, finally, it is hard to talk about climate variability at large scales and not mention the El Niño Southern Oscillation. ENSO is one of the world's best studied climate phenomena. It is a natural climate oscillation involving the ocean and the atmosphere along the equatorial Pacific, that is, along the equator between Southeast Asia and Central and South America. And this phenomenon has ample effects on weather around the globe. Now, to understand it, we need to first take a look at the normal or neutral situation. And this will require us to take a dive into the Pacific Ocean. So the equatorial Pacific Ocean is under the continuous influence of the westward blowing trade winds. They create wind stress on the warm surface waters, pushing them towards the west, where they create the West Pacific warm pool. Back in the eastern part of the basin, deep cold water is pulled to the surface to replace the surface waters that were dislocated by the winds, creating a region of cold water at the surface called the equatorial cold tongue. The resulting difference in surface temperatures along the equator then has repercussions on the atmospheric circulation above. So in the whirlpool region, the heat from the ocean is released in the atmosphere, fueling the vertical upward motion of moist air that creates 15-kilometer high cumulonimbus clouds and regular intense precipitations. The air that has now lost most of its humidity travels back east along the tropopause and descends in the eastern side of the basin, closing the atmospheric circulation loop such that the entire ocean atmosphere system is self-sustained. Now, what does this have to do with cocoa? Well, as it turns out, every few years, this system suffers disturbances, and these disturbances have consequences that ripple out much further than the equatorial Pacific region. During what we call El Niño events, the trade winds weaken, and so does their push on the surface waters. The warm waters of the Pacific warm pool travel partially back eastward, creating a warm anomaly at the surface in the central and eastern parts of the basin. And as the warm waters moves eastward, so does the entire atmospheric circulation cell we described earlier, radically modifying precipitation patterns. First, along the equatorial Pacific, and then in Australia, Southeast Asia, and Central and South America, and finally to many other more remote regions of the world, as atmospheric disturbances propagate through what we call teleconnections. And this is where we get to the relevance of ENSO to cocoa production. So El Niño years are associated to negative effects on cocoa production because of teleconnections, such as increased chances of heavy rains and floods in Ecuador and Peru that can knock flowers off and damage the trees, and drier than average conditions and forest fires in Indonesia and eastern Brazil, leading to longer-term losses in production. Now, some keen observers might have noticed that the maps we included here include no teleconnections with West Africa, While, as is the general wisdom in the cocoa community, there might be a link between strong El Niño events and bad weather resulting in low crops in West Africa, there just haven't been enough recorded such strong events to scientifically confirm this link yet. Nevertheless, because of its worldwide teleconnections, ENSO is a major source of seasonal climate prediction for many regions around the world, so it is very much well worth keeping a very close eye on. I hope that this presentation has allowed you to see that the interactions between the climate and cocoa production are numerous and complex. By mixing climate science, agronomy, plant physiology, and a solid knowledge of the cocoa production systems, we can understand and predict the effects of climate on cocoa production. Now, finally, I would like to plant a new seed for you here. Climate monitoring and predictions have improved greatly with advances in science and technology. There are lots of attempts to provide this data to farmers, but the climate data itself is not enough to be useful and actionable. But we can do much better than this. Using our understanding of these subjects and our interdisciplinary approach, we can apply climate information for monitoring and predictions alongside our agronomic expertise to help producers plan and make the right interventions at the right times, which will help improve yields. We can turn from being passive observers of climate to understanding how to use it in our favor. This is common in many agricultural products around the world, and it is now time to bring it to cocoa. And I would like to invite you on this journey with us. Thank you very much.
Great. So thank you very much, Alina and Steve, for two superb presentations. They were really interesting, and I can see a few questions coming through. So before we get started on the next phase of the session, the S&D panel, I'd like to encourage you to make use of the Q&A section. I've seen a few questions come through, but I can see there's over 350 participants on the call here, so I'm sure we can come up with many questions, both focused on the presentation and more generally on S&D, so that I don't have to spend the whole time thinking of questions for the next 45 minutes. And once again, I'd encourage you to use the Q&A rather than the chat. So before I get started, I will just reintroduce myself as Keith Heffernan, and I'm responsible for global cocoa butter sourcing for Mars Wrigley, and as Robin mentioned, and I'm coming from you today from Slough, the home of the Mars Bar. We've also got Richard Puddifoot on the line, who is the head of research for Ecom, and Frederick Wenger, who started his career at Barry Callebaut and is now the head of research at Olam. So we truly have a fantastic panel, and I hope you'll make use of that by putting some questions through the Q&A, as already mentioned. Before we get started on the S&D elements, I would like to ask a few questions of the two presentations which have just come through. So beginning with you, Steve, we had a question regarding Ecuador and your concern about overproduction there. So why are you concerned about Ecuador? Isn't it a large-scale producer which is relatively efficient using high-yielding production? And another question related is, can't they make up for the any higher cost by the fact they're selling premium cocoa?
Yeah, I think they can make up for higher costs by selling premium cocoa, but it's a relatively small market, so they're never going to, generate the sort of sales they would be able to generate if they, if they were more efficient producers. And in terms of what is the potential for Ecuador, there's a lot of land that is underutilized in Ecuador. So, if prices were back at $3,000-4,000 a ton, there would be a huge incentive to expand production and to take Ecuador out of that, if you like, niche market where they're focusing on premium sales. And that is the problem if you try to set the price too high in West Africa, that you will encourage expansion of production in West Africa, but you'll also encourage elsewhere.
Got it. Thank you very much. And a second question to you before I head to Alina. So we've had a number of questions about inflation, and obviously I think there's a great deal of interest in inflation at the moment with the potential for some inflation moving forward. Do you see any link between inflation and cocoa prices, and should we factor this inflation into our forward look of cocoa prices?
I think over the long term, clearly, prices will be to some extent inflated as general price levels rise. But, historically, in nominal terms, we've never hit the levels that we saw in the 1970s. So I'm not sure the sort of inflationary expectations we're looking at over the next few years are massively significant.
Got it. Thank you very much. Okay. So yeah, a couple of questions for you as well, Alina, now before we get into the moderation. So you may have seen a question come through about, is it possible to artificially produce and maintain the optimum conditions for photosynthesis in real life?
That's a very interesting question that one would not necessarily think of. Well, in real life, if we mean in the field, yes, certainly we can think of agroforestry as a way to mimic the original conditions in which cocoa trees grew in the Amazon basin, and there are lots of projects that are dedicated to this subject. The tricky thing with agroforestry is that yes, you can mimic the light conditions pretty easily. That's a simple thing, relatively simple thing to measure in the places where cocoa grew originally and to try to reproduce. The issue is that you will have to consider all of the interactions of these other tree species you will grow next to your cocoa. So you'll have to consider their competition for water, their competition for nutrients. And this is why there is so much research going on this topic. And I would just like to say that there are not only negative aspects to consider, there are also positive aspects to consider beyond the shading. So some tree species can protect cocoa from insects or from disease spreading. And then we know from other interactions between other tree species that through their network of roots and their interactions with the microorganisms in the soil, they can actually communicate and collaborate in sharing nutrients. But you need to know which associations to make. And this is the entire question of it.
Got it. Thank you, Alina. And sorry to start you with such a tricky question. So a second follow-up question, if that's okay. You mentioned about the effect of the harmattan on drying the soil. How tolerant are the cocoa trees to this dry weather, and how deep do the roots go? Can they survive quite a severe harmattan?
So I think in terms of actual tree survival, it is quite rare that you will have harmattan conditions that are so rough and so long that they will cause tree death, at least to a scale that can be very impactful. To answer the question about the depth of the tree's roots, the cocoa tree has the taproot that can go down to 1.5 meters, 2 meters maximum, but most of its thin roots, the ones that do all the heavy lifting in terms of water uptake from the soil, all these roots are found in the first meter. So they are very sensitive. And it's very true that with the harmattan, it matters both how dry the air gets, and we can measure that, we can monitor that, we can predict that, and how long the harmattan lasts. And this is a key point. As far as I know, just a few days of harmattan in a certain region will not cause a major stress on the trees if lighter conditions follow up. But longer conditions, especially several weeks in a row of harmattan, that can lead to severe effects on the trees. And we've seen that in the 15-16 season in West Africa.
Yeah, I would agree with Alina there. Sorry to jump in here, Keith, but I think typically we see 10 to 14 days as a sort of average harmattan period in West Africa. And from experience, and this isn't from a sort of agronomic experience, it's from more of a sort of climate experience, the trees are able to withstand probably 20 days, I think, as long as it's broken up. If it's 20 days in a long period of time, that has much more of an impact as opposed to, let's say, 4 or 5 periods of 4 or 5 days. the longer periods of time have much more of an impact because the tree is under those conditions for a longer period of time and it doesn't have an opportunity to recover. In 15-16, we saw, I think we saw the worst harmattan on record going back to probably the 1970s. And there you had discrete periods where you had 5 or 6 days where the harmattan was very severe. I don't believe we saw any serious rounds of killing trees, but we certainly saw a big impact on mid crop production. There was no doubt about that.
I fully agree with what Richard added. And it's also very important, not just that these periods of harmattan not be continuous, but also if there can be some showers in between, that can make a huge difference on how well the trees will manage the second episodes and so on.
Great, thank you both. And yeah, thank you, Richard, for jumping in. I encourage the panelists to feel free to jump in at any point when they've got some insight to add. Let's continue on the weather theme then and have a think about the, we've just started the new main crop season, 21-22. So maybe starting with you, Richard, would you consider that the weather has been favorable for the current main crop season in West Africa?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think it's been a story of, I don't know, 2 or 3 halves, if that's possible. It's not possible, obviously, but it's certainly been a story of 2 halves. You had excellent rainfall just before the start of the new rainy season, which was unusual, and we did expect it actually, but it was unusual. That led some people to believe that actually the first half of the rainy season was then going to be, very positive. In fact, it wasn't. We had very, very poor rainfall, very below average conditions through the periods of April and May, through the months of April and May. Which led us to, we track soil moisture data as one of the most important proxies for how the weather is impacting the West African crop, and actually we do it globally rather than just West African. But for West Africa, we use ERA 5 data, and I mean, we've got weather stations dotted around the cocoa belt, but the best proxy for an overall gauge on soil moisture in my opinion, tends to be ERA 5. And if you look at that data, you'll see that by the time you got to the end of May, soil moistures were pretty near their record low. In fact, they were at a 20-year record low. Soil moisture should be building really beautifully at that point in the season, and it wasn't this year. So we had deficits through April, May, definitely. We then had a very nice increase in rainfall. Soil moistures built during June and July. And we actually almost approached a record maximum soil moisture by the time we got to July. So we've had a really mixed bag of conditions. As we then went through towards the end of the primary rainy season into the what I call the mini dry season, end of July into August, that was very normal. Which was great for the trees because soil moisture had been elevated to a high degree, and really what they needed was a bit of a break from that moisture, because otherwise there was a threat of black pod coming. So the mini dry season was very normal, and then the secondary rainy season arrived, which we're in now, and we had unbelievable rainfall. So we had huge surpluses, really, particularly in Ghana. And parts of Ivory Coast, but generally speaking, across the West African belt, we popped back up to sort of maximum soil moisture again during, throughout the month of September and into early October. Since then, it's started to drop away again, and actually we're much nearer normal soil moisture conditions at the moment, from what I'm looking at. So you've had a real mixed bag, and you've had that dry period, I think is the most important bit. Actually, in April, May, it's the most important part that the market's been looking at for the last few months. It's impacted the pod counts. You've seen low pod loads for the early part of the main crop, for sure. But now all forecasts are taking on board the new rains and the fact that we've had really great soil moistures over the course of the last month to 6 weeks. We've had high temperatures as well, above average normal temperatures. Which when you combine good rainfall and high temperatures, that's absolutely perfect for the crop. We saw that in 2010. this is all as a result, by the way, of the warm temperatures in the Gulf of Guinea. So the Gulf of Guinea at the moment is really warm. There's a positive correlation between that warmth and enhanced rainfall in West Africa. And of course, that helps with the temperatures as well. So first half of the crop, you've got under the conditions or set under the conditions of dry soil moistures, poor conditions, low 20-year low soil moistures. And the second half of the crop, which we're now seeing, and our pod counts come back, and we're seeing, great setting. The question now is the survival going to be good enough to sustain us through to the end of the rainy season? My opinion, yes, I think it will. I think soil moistures are where they need to be. Temperatures are where we'd like them. Black pod is not an issue at the moment. Surprisingly, I thought it would become an issue. It hasn't necessarily become an issue for various reasons. And we now the forecasts look like we progress towards the end of the secondary rainy season with fairly normal conditions, if not slightly above normal rainfall. So yeah, a tale of two halves with the mini dry season squashed in the middle, but poor to begin with and amazing to end, really.
Yeah, if I can add to that. So Richard took you through the climatic roller coaster that this year has been, and in relation to this, there was really a roller coaster of emotions, if I can say so, when it came to predicting how the crop will develop. So as Richard pointed out, in the very beginning, end of February, March, we had some really good early rains, and everybody was thinking, well, okay, the rainy season is upon us, we will have an early crop. The trees were in great shape. We thought for sure we would get an early crop. Then the dryness in April, May, and even to some extent June in Ghana hit, and all of a sudden there was very little setting compared to what it should be. So then we knew we were going into a late crop profile, which is the case now. Now, because the crop profile was late, it was going to reach its peak of susceptibility to Cherelle wilting right when the little dry season would hit. So again, there was a risk there that, okay, we finally got a setting, but we could lose it if the little dry season is too harsh. But then it turned out that the July rains were extremely strong, so they built up a lot of resilience, and also the little dry season was not at all harsh. It actually ended in the second half of August, so quite early, which meant that the trees had no problems crossing this period. And then the final bit of excitement was the fact that we were seeing these high precipitations since September with high temperatures. These are very good conditions for the black pod disease to spread, and it was indeed a big risk. Now it looks like it is not the case based on field reports. So it could be in Ghana, it could be because the pod load was too low for the disease to easily spread. It needs to spread from one pod to another mostly. So if there aren't enough pods on the trees, it will have a harder time going from one tree to another. In Ivory Coast, probably because of good management, it is actually a bit of a point of mystery. But here we are, and I do agree with what Richard said with respect to what we expect in the next months. Right now, October looks like it's brought already quite a bit of rain. It could still bring some. And from November onwards, we actually have quite little visibility over rainfall. We know that it's going to keep being warmer than average, although even the likelihood of warmer than average conditions goes down slowly as we move into December, January. And that's actually a good thing. So it being warmer now when there's enough water means that the crops can develop faster, as I explained during the presentation. It speeds up the processes of inside the plant. So it also speeds up the growth of the pods, the filling of the pods, the maturation, which means that we're catching up a little bit of that lateness in the profiles, especially in Ivory Coast. After that, as we go into the main dry season, the fact that the temperatures will be somewhat less likely than they were until now to be above average, even though they will still probably be above average. It's a good omen, because that's when we will start having less and less water. So the trees would like to have less pressure to be fast and to produce a lot. So yes, so far I think that as Richard, I think we are decently well set for the survival of the current crops.
Got it. Thank you very much, both.
I also thought your point in the presentation where you highlighted that cocoa isn't necessarily just susceptible to to low rainfall, it's also susceptible to high rainfall is important here, and it's important in places like Ecuador and Indonesia, which I'm sure we'll come to later. But particularly this year, where we've got this extra rainfall at the end of during the secondary rainy season, which is definitely going to be positive for production as we go forward, because of your point that West Africa actually doesn't necessarily quite have enough rainfall through the season to be really beneficial for cocoa. So anything extra, as long as we don't get black pod as an issue, in my opinion, will be positive.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both. And I'm going to jump in now because I can see Frederick has been patiently waiting for 1 hour. So we're definitely going to be in the next half an hour, be relying on your expertise here. So Fred, if I can start with you. We've heard a little bit here about the rainfall that we've had and kind of a mixed bag, let's say. What do you think that means for the main crop outlooks in Ivory Coast and Ghana? Can we see a repeat of last season's record crops? And can they still improve from here, given the good weather we've seen?
So yeah, I think that Alina and Richard perfectly summarized the situation that we've seen in Ivory Coast and in Ghana. Basically, what we think is that indeed, as Richard said, initial setting and development was very poor due to these unusually dry conditions during the peak of the main rainy season. So which is running through from April through end of June. It was particularly poor in Ghana, but it was also the same. It was also poor in Ivory Coast, basically. So we think that soil moisture was never really critical in Ivory Coast or in Ghana, but it was clearly low enough to basically to suppress pot setting, a proper pot setting over much of the cocoa belt at this time. And also, I think what is important to highlight is that the lack of rain in both origins also meant less fertilizer application, which is important. So this was basically the situation 3 months ago. And in Ghana, it was actually at that time, it was particularly bad. The new crop pod load was subnormal in all regions. And overall, it was probably something like more than 30% below normal. So it was never seen before. And back then, the new crop potential was looking far worse than in any other years, basically. That is for Ghana. And then, so for both countries, as Alina and Richard perfectly explained, we had this second rainy season, which was early, which started early and very strong, and we had an exceptional late pod set and a strong survival of cereals. So things have clearly improved over the past few weeks. And the weather conditions right now are still favorable, so we probably can expect a continuation of strong pod setting. But the risk I see here is that we have a late profile, and we have a pod load which is made of cereals. The pod load right now is mostly in cereal form. So these cereals are particularly at risk of wilting. So even though the conditions are good right now, we are going to the dry season. So these cereals will have to make it through the dry season to the harvest. And I think we are quite in uncharted territory right now because basically we've never seen such a late pod set. So I think this is one risk here, is that what is going to be the survival rate in the next few weeks or months. And then there is another risk, I think, is that it's this late main pod setting could have actually a negative effect on the mid-crop development. The question is, is it going to suppress the setting which we would see normally between November and January, for example, for this mid-crop? So just to summarize, yes, there is a very poor start, particularly in Ghana. There has been a very strong improvement, but there are a lot of risks right now.
If I may add a little something to that, Frederic is absolutely right about pointing out that the late pod profiles means that these pods will be more exposed to the negative effects of the dry season. If there's one silver lining, is that the current climate projections of the harmattan indicates that we don't have a reason to fear a strong harmattan season, at least right now. So we think that especially until January, we will see normal or milder than normal harmattan conditions. Now that is not enough to ensure good survival, and it's true because we have a late main crop profile that could discourage the trees from setting a lot of pods early for the mid crop, for the next mid crop. So we could have a chain of late profiles all together. But for sure, what will matter greatly is how much rain we can accumulate until we go into the main dry season. And that will be a big player into how the pods will survive, how much the trees will decide to take on in terms of pod load, should they set the mid crop soon or not. All this will be heavily impacted by how much rain, how much resilience, how much soil water we can build up until the main dry season.
Thanks, Alina. And Richard, I don't know if you would agree with that. And I'm trying to link here potentially the La Nina risk that we see coming. I know Alina referenced El Nino in West Africa. Would the La Nina support a less harsh dry season at all and a better outlook for the mid crop therefore?
I think La Nina is far more relevant for origins such as Ecuador and Indonesia. I noted Alina's point in her presentation about the potential for strong El Niños and strong La Niñas may well have an impact in the sense of a teleconnection with West Africa, but that's fairly unproven, to be honest, because the samples of those events is so small. But if I may, before I go on to La Nina, if I may just go through harmattan, as I know from doing this for the last sort of 15 years or so, trying to predict the harmattan this far out has been a dangerous thing to try and do. And short range forecasting for sure, you know, is actually very accurate. I think 10 to 15 days, even longer, you can get a very good indication from what the dew points are doing and where the intertropical convergence zone actually lay. And where the wind flow is. You can generally get a good perception as to whether or not the crop is going to be under the influence of harmattan 10 to 15 days out, and sometimes a little further. Longer range, there is certainly some skill in terms of forecasting it. I've personally, the way I do it is look at pressure anomalies over Northwest Africa and Southwest Europe and try and project those further forward. Forecasting pressure longer range is one of the more robust features within the models if you want to look at models in terms of going long range. And so there is a correlation between pressure over Northwest Africa and Southwest Europe and enhanced harmattan in January. And so that's really the only way I sort of can gain a handle on whether or not harmattan is going to be above average or below average through the season. I look at that. And currently there's a suggestion in certainly the ECMWF data that there'll be a high pressure over the UK during that period. So a bit too far north, really. Higher than normal pressure anomalies look likely, although that comes with the caveat that we're talking about January here, and that's a long way off in terms of weather modeling. But higher than normal pressure over the UK and Northwest Europe wouldn't really influence the harmattan. And so I would go for a neutral sort of harmattan at the moment, fairly normal. But if that pressure anomaly shifted south over the course of, or in the key months of, let's say, Christmas, New Year, and into January, then that could have an influence in terms of positively enhancing the harmattan. So I'll be looking at that very closely in terms of how those pressure forecasts shift over the course of the next 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and then into the harmattan season. But as I say, there is a positive correlation between high pressure and enhanced harmattan. And if that region that's currently advertised as affecting northwestern Europe, if that shifts into southwest Europe and northwest Africa, that has a different effect. That will enhance it. But yeah, these are things that we have to look at, and we're only in mid-October, so we've got plenty of time to adjust our forecast. But currently, that's what I'd be looking at. In terms of La Nina, definitely there's scope for a La Nina building. We've been under La Nina influence now for a long time, it feels, even though the La Nina hasn't been particularly strong. There's good evidence, both from the forecast models, which suggest a re-strengthening of La Nina over the course of the next couple of months into Christmas. There's good evidence from them. There's quite a good agreement between the models as well. And there's also good supporting evidence in terms of the subsurface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. If you look at those, you can see already the cool conditions are in place. There's an eastward moving Kelvin wave which brings cool water east and up to the surface, and that is already in place. So we're certainly going to see La Nina develop further from where we are now. It's definitely going to get cooler. How cool it gets is where the models are debating at the moment. The US model has it as a far more intense scenario than the ECMWF model does at the moment. And so, yeah, I think we're going to see a re-strengthening of La Nina over the course of the next couple of months.
I'm just going to intervene at this particular moment. I see that Keith has seemingly disappeared, so I hope he's okay. But allow me to continue the good work until Keith returns. So I'm interested in the ENSO, and I just wanted to continue that. Just for a moment, I had a theory going back a number of years that if you looked at the sea surface temperature in zones 3.4 in the Pacific during August, that might give you an interesting idea as to whether there was going to be an El Nino or not, event or not, and that would affect the price of cocoa, which is what everyone's listening in to try and understand whether or not where the prices are going to go. Have any of you actually looked at that relationship? I mean, something really quite simple, really quite fundamental, and whether or not that actually has a price effect. Keith, I see you're back. Most welcome.
Thank you.
I just intervened for a moment and asked a question about ENSO. So, Frederick, would you be able to answer that?
Oh, I'm not sure about it. I'm not a specialist.
Okay, all right.
No, I think well, my opinion is that, yeah, for me there is a positive correlation or negative correlation. I don't know the way you take it, between ENSO and global production, and also between ENSO and production in West Africa. Actually, even though it's probably less obvious, I think to remember that we found a correlation between El Nino and Harmattan season, for example. So that when there is an El Nino, there is more risk of harsh Harmattan conditions, and the opposite with the La Nina. And yeah, so.
Yeah, I take it rather as a chartist. So I don't know the facts, although I do know that the meteorologists say that there is no correlation between the weather patterns in West Africa and ENSO. And I'm perfectly prepared to accept that. But actually, when I plot the production of cocoa and compare it to El Nino events, and that includes La Nina, there does seem to be a correlation. So maybe this has something more to do with sunspots than anything else. In other words, no relationship at all. But nonetheless, there seems to be something there. So apologies, Keith, I've intervened.
No.
Back
Thanks
to you.
for saving the day. And I was struggling. This is my first day back in the office for 18 months, actually. So I should have stayed at home, to be honest, because we lost our internet connection there. So that'll teach me for trying to get back to the brave new world. But let's go on to the questions. I know when I dropped off, Richard was explaining about ENSO. So I want to link that with Indonesia. And I've seen a question come through about what has Latin America done right that Indonesia has done wrong in terms of we've seen one region's production really go up and one drop. So Steve, can I start with you on that one?
Yeah, I think it's you shouldn't look at it as what has someone done right and someone done wrong. I think people have reacted differently to different circumstances. Malaysia was clearly drawn into cocoa when it should never have been. End of story. And that's been proven, and it's gone back to where it started, having caused mayhem for many years. Indonesia is a different case. There you've got potentially competing crops. You've got a less commercialized, I would argue, a less commercialized unit when compared with Ecuador, Malaysia, probably slightly more so than when compared with West Africa. And the farmers there are very flexible in terms of making strategic decisions depending on the price of competing crops. So if they find that palm oil is particularly remunerative, then there's an incentive to shift. And so it's not the decline in Indonesian production isn't necessarily because they've done anything wrong. It's just that they found something better to do. And to me, that's a philosophy that could be extended right the way across cocoa producing regions. If you don't like the price of cocoa, try and find something else. In Ivory Coast, for instance, we've seen a lot of rubber. I actually think a lot of farmers were missold rubber. They were told the yield's going to be great and so on and so forth. They were told what the sort of yields that were being generated in Asia, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and in West Africa. They were never able to get those yields. So that proved to be a false shift. But you've always got to look for alternatives.
Got it. And Fred, would you relate to that question? Would you consider Indonesia has any opportunity to recover production? I know we've seen it up at 600,000 and now it's struggling around the 200,000 area.
Yeah, I don't know. It has been on a downtrend for many years now, since the mid 2000s, basically. I think that farmers there are facing a very strong pressure from pest and disease, and particularly 4 of them: the VSD, vascular stripe dieback, the cocoa pod borer, the black pod, and also the truck borer. And all these pests and diseases are difficult and expensive to control. And therefore, as Steve said, farmers can be very quick to shift to other crops if they think that profitability is better elsewhere. They are also replanting. Now it's particularly clones, and these new varieties are highly yielding and also VSD resistant for some of them. The problem is that CPB, so the pod borer, is relentless, and actually this demands a lot of spraying. So before all this disease in Indonesia, cocoa farming was largely seen, as an easy crop. But I think that now farmers in general, are going to see it, or are already seeing it as a tough and expensive.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, let's stick with you. Actually, we've spoken a lot about production, but I would like to look at the demand element here. So, how do you see the demand recovery since we've come out of COVID this year? Is the recovery stronger than you surprised? And what do you see as the outlook for the remainder of the 21-22 crop?
So yeah, basically, we think that the pandemic had a negative impact on demand, and all 3 products, so liquor, butter, and also powder, were negatively impacted by the COVID-19. So we had negative growth for these products in 1920. What we see is that actually powder was more resilient than chocolate. So powder was more resilient than liquor butter. We had also a contrast by region. Liquor butter, so chocolate basically was negative everywhere, except in Eastern Europe, sorry, where we had a marginal growth in 1920. As for powder, it declined the most in Western Europe and in Asia, but it was about flat in Eastern Europe. It was also flat in Africa, Middle East, and North America. And actually, it was positive in South America, which was quite a bit surprising because South America had a very tough COVID-19 effect. So in 2021, we had a recovery which was broad-based. And we basically with global demand for all these products, which grew comfortably above their pre-pandemic levels.
Great, strong recovery. Thank you, Frederic. Steve, I think we've heard a little bit about the strong demand outlook there. We've heard about some concerns about the main crops or the possibility of recovery. Question for you about the overall S&D then. Do you think that the new seasons will be a deficit, and can that deficit be larger than the previous season's surplus?
Yes, I think it probably will be a deficit, and no, I don't think it will be anywhere near the size of the previous year's surplus. And the fact that the West African crops, that quite honestly, 6 weeks ago, Ghana looked an absolute disaster. I've never seen anything like it. Even 1993, which I remember, was nothing like it. That has improved. So we're clawing back some of the losses. We're never going to claw back. If you look at the main crop as, start, middle, end, and apportion it, let's say 20, 60, 20, just for round numbers, we lost a chunk of that 20% at the start. We lost a big chunk of that 60% in the middle. So no matter how good the tail is, we're not going to get it back. But we could still claw back some of it. And I'm actually cautiously optimistic about the mid-crops. I wonder if the improvement we're seeing in the tail of the main crop is going to carry on and is actually a precursor of an exceptional start to the mid-crop. That wouldn't surprise me because, quite honestly, given what I've seen over the last 6 months, nothing would surprise me. So we could certainly claw some back. I think the risk at the moment is probably that the deficit shrinks rather than it grows.
Do you agree with that assessment broadly, Frederic? Do you think that the deficit could get larger from here or even be larger than last year? Last year's surplus, I should say. Well,
we think it could go either way, for example. Basically, I mean, for the time being, we have a deficit 21-22, which is not as large as the surplus last year, but yeah, we think it can go either way. We've got Ivory Coast and Ghana, according to us, which is below trend, which both crops below trend. I've highlighted the risk just earlier, so but the recent dynamics are in favor of further improvement, for sure. But then, there is this risk, I think, about the fact that most of the pod load is still in shell form, and that we are going to the dry season, even though there is no or very little harmattan due to La Niña, for example, this year. Even if we have mild conditions, I mean, the lack of rainfall and the fact that this shell will have to compete with a growing population of bigger pods, I think is a risk. So honestly, yes, it could go toward a bigger deficit or a smaller deficit. It's very uncertain.
Got it. Thank you, Frederic. And I think good reason to do maybe to do another seminar in a few months' time, and we'll see the next outlook for the S&D. Then I'll try and have a reliable Wi-Fi connection as well. So let me finish with a couple of climate questions, and just if we can just take a minute each for these guys, because I know we're running a bit tight on time. So Alina, I've seen a few questions come through from producers in the origin countries really interested in your presentation and asking, how can they use climate data to improve, their yield or the livelihoods of the farmers in their country? How can we use this data?
Okay, so it's important to know that in most of the cocoa producing regions, cocoa is grown in a rather passive way when it comes to climate effects. So more specifically, there's hardly ever any irrigation. So with this as the base, the suggestion is not necessarily to overhaul the way in which cocoa is produced. That's a question that's much more charged than can we help with climate? It involves many more aspects. So this is not what we are proposing. However, farmers do take some action in their fields to help the cocoa tree along the year. So they use fertilization at times. They do pruning. They can decide to apply pesticides, fungicides. They can decide to do manual pollination in region where natural pollination is not good enough. And all of these things, all of these measures are taken when they are taken based on very old empirical evidence of when it is good to do it. Either that, or sometimes even semi-randomly in terms of timing. And this is where we think that we can do a whole lot better by not changing very much. You only change the timing, but you make sure that it is well adapted to the current climate. So we can use the climate information also of the past few decades, because the climate, especially in West Africa, we definitely have a climate trend. It is not stable. Temperatures have gone up continuously and they are projected to keep going up. And this has many, many ramifications on the trees' processes. So the idea is to look at how cocoa production is being done in each region and simply adapt the timing of the activities in the field to take into account climate information and to take into account not only the long-term trends, but also the projections. Right now, we have more and more seasonal predictability. We can take that into account. And of course, when it comes down to precision, if the communication is good enough between the information providers and the farmers taking the action in the field, you can even go down to using weather forecasting to say, okay, the conditions in the next week are good for applying the fertilizer or not, and so on and so forth. So it's really in this light that we think about doing things. And then of course there are lots of advice to be given on whether or not some activities should be taken. For example, I know Robin was at some point telling me that there could be issues with manual pollination, and I do agree with that. And there are things to be said about how to improve natural pollination.
Thank you very much.
I love when experts are talking. That was a very long minute. Thank you very much, Alina. Keith, back to you.
No, I think no. Thank you, Alina. It was a great detail. And Richard, apologies we can't get to your question, but I would like to thank all the two presentations and the four panelists for a really interesting discussion. I think we can see from the number of attendees, it's been really successful, and we'll definitely look to continue this webinar series. Sorry I couldn't get to all the questions in the Q&A. I will definitely pass them on to the panelists, and where capacity allows, they will answer them. I think both Steve and Alina did share their contact details as well. So Robin, without further ado, I should pass back to you for the last couple of minutes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid, like all good things, they come to an end. Thank you all for your attendance and also for your questions. And as Keith has said, we will pass them on. I'm sorry that this format is so difficult to deal with all the questions. However, online, so to speak. But before we actually conclude, I would like to actually give you some more good news. And that is that the FCC first has online modules. You can subscribe to these at any time. Please see our website for details. And second, that our courses, Introduction to Cocoa and Cocoa Contracts and Arbitration, will occur during June 2022 over 1 week, and they will be based here in London. So these will be face-to-face courses. They are very popular. and spaces are limited. So if you are interested in attending, please keep your eyes open when the registration begins in 2022. I need to warn you that priority is naturally given to FCC members, together with discounts. That said, I look forward to seeing you taking up these two options. Please also look out for our next webinar. It's likely to be in the new year, at which I hope that you will also be able to join us. So to just wrap up, I need to say thank you, first of all, to the presenters, Steve and Alina. Excellent presentations, thank you very much. The additional panelists of Richard and Frederick, and the moderator, Keith, for making this a very interesting and informative webinar. So thank you for that. And I just need to say a special thanks go to Climate 42 for helping us to organize this webinar, particularly Charles Werner. Thank you, Charles. My last thanks go to all of you for joining us today. Throughout the world, we have people from 60 countries that have registered with us. I hope you found this session of interest, and we look forward to your attendance in our future educational events. Thank you again, and goodbye from the City of London. Goodbye.